Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Robin Hanson, who is a professor of economics at George Mason University, also the author of a couple books. This one, I think it's about five, I don't know, maybe even older. I forget exactly when this was. The Elephant in the Brain, co-authored with Kevin Simler. Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. And this one, a little bit older, called The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth. And you've also got I guess it's a blog, Substack. They still call them blogs now? Is that what it is?
I do. I'm just stuck in the past.
Right? Called Overcoming Bias, and also a podcast that you co-host called Minds Almost Meeting. Welcome, Robin.
Nice to meet you.
So maybe I thought we'd start with this book, The Elephant in the Brain. A lot of us in business schools, we teach courses on sort of judgment and decision making, right? And following up in the bias and heuristic tradition, we like to talk about how people behave in ways that appear to be irrational, or at least inconsistent with the norms that we associate with Homo economicus. And so, a lot of what we're trying to do is maybe perhaps reverse engineer the decision-making model that people use, but I think that discipline tries to stay away, or doesn't really dig too deep into why it is that people behave those ways, right? There usually isn't sort of a functional explanation as to why these behaviors might be ecologically rational. And I think in this book, The Elephant in the Brain, you try to do that. And I mean, you're consistent with the JDM literature in the sense that you are very skeptical of people's subjective accounts of why they do things, and so you kind of pay very little attention to what people say they're doing, because you say that their motives are usually unconscious or hidden. And I think that you're really channeling La Rochefoucauld. And I remember reading La Rochefoucauld I don't know, 40 years ago, and thinking, wow, really cynical, but actually very insightful about our selfish motives. So I guess the first question is, you say that this literature draws on microsociology and some other disciplines, but it seems like it really is economics at the end of the day that you're doing, right? A lot of it's about signaling models. A lot of it's about acquiring, the goods of status, prestige, dominance, and so forth. Do you consider the book to be fundamentally an economics book?
We do, I think. But it was classified as psychology. That is, the publisher and reviewers, etc., saw it as a psychology book. And they often complained that its main claim isn't news in psychology. Psychologists have long accepted that most people aren't very aware of their motives in a wide range of contexts. But that news hasn't gotten out to social science practice because most economists and even most social scientists basically take the usual story about why we do things at face value. So they would assume that you go to school to learn the material, you go to the doctor to get well, you vote in order to make a better, nation. People just start with that as your main goal, and then they try to explain all the details in each area on that basis. Economists will do it a bit different than sociologists or even political scientists or anthropologists would, but they usually start from that shared assumption that whatever people say is their reason for doing something is in fact their reason. Even though the psychologists and many others have repeatedly demonstrated that people are often quite wrong about their motives, still most health economists, most education, social scientists, etc., even business theorists, they will tend to take at face value the stated motives of people regarding what they're doing. So our approach here is very simple. It's just to replace the usual stated motive with some other plausible motive that isn't the usual stated motive, and then use that to explain all the puzzling details that people might otherwise invoke other features for. So in that sense, yes, we're an economist because we don't need anything other than the usual sort of rational actor model if we substitute a different motive for the usual motive. In some sense, it's a very trivial thing, you might think. I mean, infrastructure doesn't need to change at all, pretty much, other than this one detail that maybe you're not so aware of your motives. But the rest of the rational actor calculation can go on just fine.
Well, I mean, there is a long tradition in psychology about unconscious or subconscious motivation, particularly the Freudian account. But that account doesn't, I mean, you reject that account because it doesn't. It seems non-functional in the social context.
Well,
right?
I mean, our key point is that when people talk about Freudian things, they're talking about maybe some unusual events in your life and your unusual attitude toward things, or even with the behavioral things, it's about sort of unusual situations where you might be more behavioral. But we're just focused on large areas of life. And typically all this Freudian or even other sorts of pontificating about how we're all confused and don't really know things, somehow that never penetrates these other large areas of life where people just assume, well, yeah, of course, but we know why you go to school, we know why you go to the doctor, we know why you go to the grocery store, we know why you get married. Of course we know all that, but maybe we aren't so sure about your motives for, something weird. And so we're basically applying this idea to the most ordinary things.
Yeah. Maybe we'll start off with medicine, because I think you've done work in this field for a long time. And I think a lot of economists are puzzled by the huge amount of resources that we devote to the medicine sector, the medical sector, without really getting the benefits that one would expect to get with this huge amount of expenditure. And it's a bit of a puzzle. And I think economists have focused on things like the incentives of the multi-payer system and agency problems and adverse selection and standard economics. But you emphasize something very different. Maybe you could talk about, how did you first get interested in medicine, and did this pursuit of study of medicine lead to your interest in these kind of subconscious and social motivations, or was it the other way around?
So I got my PhD in social science at Caltech from 1993 to 97. And Caltech is a very mathematical, abstract, theoretical place. And previously I'd been a computer researcher. So I leaned into the usual abstract mathematics, given my background. And in that sort of a frame, one looks at medicine and basically assumes that it's about what everybody says it's about. And then when you see strange things, you try to come up with stories to make sense of those strange things in the usual terms. And then, of course, at the end of my 4-year PhD program, I wanted to get a job, and I applied to many jobs, but I did not get a tenure track academic job. I did manage to get a health policy postdoc at UC Berkeley, which I then took and spent 2 years learning about the details of medicine and pondering that. And there was quite a contrast between the details of medicine and the abstract theoretical description of medicine. Theorists just typically are willing to make all the usual assumptions that anybody might make and then just do a more complicated math about it. But when you look at the actual details of medicine, it's really quite in contrast with these high-level descriptions of what it's supposedly about. And that was just staring me in the face for 2 years, because that was that health policy postdoc. And so I, staring at all those details, was wondering, well, what could be going on here? And so again, the key breakthrough is to say, well, what if people are just not right about their reasons here? And I had recently been reading about evolutionary psychology, so ideas in that area were available to me as candidate explanations. And I basically thought, well, what if people in medicine are trying to show that they care about each other and to let other people show they care about them? In ordinary language, that's not that strange a hypothesis. When most people think about medicine and the relation to it, this hypothesis isn't crazy. But it's still not something that economists had spent much time on, nor most other health specialists, specialists who study medicine. They mostly had, again, looked at our medical spending as a way to achieve better health. And they'd study all those complicated variations, and then if stuff doesn't make sense, they might say, oh, well, we need to reject economics, say, and think in other terms because, etc. But I just said, well, what if medicine's about showing that you care? Then it would make sense of a bunch of the other puzzles. Now, what we haven't told our audience here yet is, what are these puzzles? We've just said the details don't, in fact, fit the abstract theory well, but they don't know what they are. They don't necessarily believe us yet. So we should start to explain what some of these details are.
Well, I mean, look, I get it, right? People want to feel cared for, and people want to demonstrate that they care. And I can see how that would work at the kind of personal level, right? So you mentioned in the book, when somebody is sick, then someone will bring over casseroles, right? Or, somebody will
Right.
offer to, alleviate their suffering, or to, provide some support and so forth. And that reassures people that they are not abandoned by the group and so forth. And so the people who are offering the help are signaling that they are people who are reliable allies and friends. But when you scale this up to the institutional level, it seems a little harder to understand, right? Because these people who are...
I think that's just a mental block. I think for some reason people think that in our personal lives we have all these emotional reasons for doing things, and then as soon as there's some official in some building somewhere and you write a piece, you send them official pieces of paper back and forth, then all these personal reasons just disappear and are irrelevant. And certainly with respect to official institutions with official government subsidies and regulation, well, those things just must be serious things. And all these silly little personal emotions would be set aside because we would be seriously trying to make sure real, important stuff happens. And that's just wrong. I'm sorry. The political institutions that we're in and our business, etc., they're all driven by the same sort of personal demands and the same sort of customers, and even in their employees. That is, it's the same humans, and it's fundamentally the human customers who are driving the process in all these different dimensions. People themselves, what they want, how they feel, how they relate, that's driving how they interact personally with people. It's driving which jobs they pick. It's driving which customers they buy. It's driving how they vote and which candidates they elect and what policies they pick. It's all the same stuff.
Well, so then with respect to healthcare, I mean, one would think that would mean that these healthcare providers would compete on the basis of, say, bedside manner, or compete on the basis of...
And they do. They do, in fact, compete on the basis of bedside manner. That's a thing. But often what people want is the bedside manner of somebody who doesn't seem to care that much about you and is just very serious and just going to make sure they get it right, because that's how you show you care. You show you care by making sure you paid for this person who's going to be a little rude and a little distant and a little technical, so that you can convince them you really care about them because, look, you bought them this very serious person.
Well, I think the policy implications are that the marginal benefit of incremental healthcare is close to zero. I think you say that we could probably spend a lot less than we currently spend on healthcare and get the same health results. What would we be giving up if we did that?
So I have an editorial from a while back titled "Cut Medicine in Half," which is a nice, clear policy. And the idea would be, I even listed recently 5 different ways you could decide which is the good and the bad half. And each of those is feasible, so all 5 certainly would be even more feasible. And the idea then is to just do less and pay for less and be just as healthy. The problem, though, is if other people are paying for all of it and you're only paying for half of it, and you're paying this on the behalf of people you supposedly love, they might think, well, you don't love me so much because you weren't willing to spend as much as these other people on this stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's the problem with just individually, personally cutting in half. But if you can convince your associates that, in fact, you do love them just as much and you'd rather spend this money on them in some other way, then go for it. Cut medicine in half personally.
So there might be cheaper ways to communicate to people that they are cared for, right, and that we care for them. other than these massive
Well,
expenditures?
I mean, there's a sense in which if it's a costly signal, it has to cost a lot.
Right.
But maybe you could get more benefit to them for the same amount of cost you're paying. Maybe there are other ways you could help your associates that they would actually find more useful.
Well, maybe we can back up and talk about these motives. And it seems that the motives that you focus on are primarily social motives, right? Motives that involve you trying to establish a position in society, right? To be sort of relatively higher in some kind of pecking order, and also to signal to others that you are competent, right, and attractive as a partner, and both for mating and for kind of working collectively with others. And so why is it that it's so important that we do this in a way that is invisible to ourselves? Right? Why aren't people sort of
that's the
consciously
central
saying,
question.
"Hey, I got to boost my status," right?
Right. So all of them, so just to remind, readers might not know, the first third of our book just argues in general about why you might not know about your motives and why that might be a thing. And then the last 2/3 goes over 10 areas of life. In each area we say, here's what you say your motive is. Here are some puzzles that don't make sense with that. And then here's a better motive that makes more sense of the things you do in their details. So that's the structure of the book. And then a general question that makes sense in that context is, well, why don't we just know why we're doing things? Each of the motives we suggest are your real motives. They're not crazy motives. They're plausible motives. And when we tell them to you, you'll nod and go, that's not a crazy motive. That's a sort of motive I sometimes see in the world. So it's the sort of thing that could be my motive or other people's motives. And so then the question is, well, why don't you just know that? And for that, we have to appeal to the general nature of human relations, which is that humans have norms. Humans have rules about what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do, especially regarding each other. And we really care a lot about our associates not violating those norms. And we're very eager to find rivals violating them and call them out on that. And that's just a really big thing in our lives. And in fact, it's so big that plausibly your conscious mind, the part of your mind I'm talking to, isn't the entire mind you have. Notice you've got lots of stuff going on in your head that you're not very conscious of, but your conscious mind is the part of you whose job it is mainly to watch what you're doing and at all moments have a story about why you're doing it and why this thing you're doing, for the reason you're doing it, isn't something violating norms. If you didn't have this conscious mind all the time putting together the story, you would be much more vulnerable to other people claiming that you're violating norms and accusing you of being a bad person for doing bad things. You don't want that, so you're ready at all times to defend yourself. But in order to do that, you have to be tracking what you're doing and have a story about what you're doing and why that's not so bad. So that's who you are. That's what your conscious mind is. And so this conscious mind isn't necessarily supposed to know the actual truth about what you do and why. It's supposed to have up this story that defends yourself. So an analogy we give is the president versus the press secretary. The president doesn't talk to the public so much. They've got this press secretary that talks to the public, and people ask the press secretary questions about the president and their motives and what they're doing, and the press secretary doesn't actually know that much about what the president does or why. But the press secretary's job is to make up a story. Have some plausible story about everything the president does and why they're doing it and why that's not such a bad thing to be doing. And they're not knowing exactly what the president is doing and why actually helps them in their job, because if they actually knew why, it might be hard maybe to make up a story about why it's not so bad. But if you don't really know why they're doing what they're doing, you can just comfortably, confidently make up a story about why what they're doing is perfectly okay and the reasonable sort of thing you would want the president to be doing. So that's what your conscious mind is doing to you. It's making up these stories, and therefore in the process of making up these stories, it doesn't need to know your actual motives. And if your actual motives are more vulnerable to an accusation of violating a norm, then it's just going to substitute a better motive. And that's our story about these hidden motives and why they're hidden from us. That is, For example, in medicine, the reason you do it is to show you care. Now you might think, well, showing you care isn't such a bad motive. It's not such a bad motive, but it's still a bit more vulnerable to the criticism of favoritism than just trying to help their health or your own health. This real motive you have is actually more selfish. It's more trying to make sure they understand that you are the one who cares and you are the one who are doing the caring. It's not so much focused on them. I mean, it indirectly focused on them, but you're honestly, you care about your appearance here and you're trying to manage your appearance. And that's not something we're supposed to admit to. Basically, we have this whole part of our brain that's entirely devoted to managing our appearance. And our general story is, I don't manage my appearance. I don't have to do that. I just tell you the truth whenever you ask me a question. I just react with the truth as I see it, because why would I have to do anything else? Because I'm not managing or hiding anything. No, not me.
Yeah, I mean, so I think part of the story is that everyone's a cheater in some way. And I guess it offers up two possibilities. I mean, one possibility is that the norms exist in order to promote the good of the collectivity, and the individuals are constantly chafing at those norms to advance their own individual agendas, and so they wish to avoid detection when they're doing that. But another possibility is that the norms are what make the signals possible, right? So without the norms, it would be very difficult to get this filtration, right? Where people could demonstrate that they are better in some ways. It seems like some of the norms are set up precisely so as to impose some handicap on people's efforts to signal.
Sometimes norms are functional and helpful, and sometimes they're not. But our individual incentive doesn't care much about that. That is, our incentive is to not violate the norms and not be caught violating the norms, regardless of whether they're good or bad norms, regardless of what function they serve. We could talk about the sort of cultural evolution that produces different norms and how that could go wrong. But from the point of view of explaining our personal motives, we don't really care. We want to not be caught violating norms.
Right. So, I mean, you start off with basic social life, talk about body language and laughter and conversation, and all of that is interesting. I found the most interesting part was the part on conversation. And, I think a lot of people would say the purpose of conversation is to learn from others. Right, but when you watch people engaging in conversation, it doesn't seem like they're spending most of their time listening. They're spending most of their time talking, and if to the extent that people are listening, it's more like they're sizing up the people that they're listening to, rather than paying careful attention to the content of their words. So how is conversation a kind of signaling game rather than an exchange of content and ideas?
Right. So I gotta say that we have these habits when we ask you why you're doing something to make up these reasons that sound kind of good, but we aren't very careful about checking whether these reasons actually fit with behavior. So I think the observation that people who are in a conversation are more focused on talking and showing off than they are about collecting information from others is just really obvious if you would just pay attention to some conversations. And that makes it all the more striking that anybody would ever pretend otherwise. Mm-hmm. But people do. They say, well, the reason to talk is to share information. I will tell you some things, you will tell me some things. We'll now walk away both knowing more than we did when we started together. Therefore, of course, we're sharing information. And, there's a number of things that don't make sense in that point of view. So this is, again, the structure of our book. We point out things that don't make sense from the point of view of our standard theory. So if we were trying to share information, we would be more eager to listen than to talk, as you mentioned. We would talk about important stuff that mattered to us. We would maybe even keep track of how long other people have talked and you've talked. So I might say, look, I don't want to talk anymore. I've told you 3 things already. You've only told me 1. You need to tell me 2 more things before I'm going to talk, tell again. And I would make sure they were important things. You can't tell me about the color of your cat last Tuesday. No, that's not going to be good enough. But in fact, we don't seem to count who said how much, and we are more eager to talk, and we don't talk about very important things, and we often avoid talking about the most important things. So those all are in conflict with the story that here we are to share important information.
So the things you're trying to communicate when you're conversing are, I guess, number one, you're trying to communicate that your status and competence. You're trying to communicate that you are someone who's perhaps caring and attentive, and then I guess another one is that you would make for a good ally, right? Someone who you'd want to kind of have on your team, right?
So one thing we notice is that people don't talk about the most important things, and they tend to follow this sort of wandering structure where no one's supposed to control the direction very much. That is, the direction has to be somewhat spontaneous and nothing very controlled by any one person. And everybody's supposed to stay close, though, to whatever the recent topic is. You're not supposed to jump entirely and change a whole new topic. You're supposed to stay close, but you can't be trying to control it too much and say, no, let's talk about this next. And that looks like a test, basically. That is, you're being tested on the subject wanders, you can't control where it goes, and wherever it goes now becomes a test of, can you find something interesting to say about this? And that's how it looks like people are often playing that game. They aren't trying to control the direction, but wherever it goes, they have to have something interesting to say. And you can see that as a test, because if we were ever in a situation that mattered in the future, the question might be, well, could you find something interesting to say about that? And if you don't know what difficult situations we might be in, it might be an appropriate signal of what you might say in a difficult situation, an important situation, where what you would say in any random situation. If you can in pretty much any random situation have something interesting to say, I think I can be pretty confident then when something really matters, you'll also have something interesting to say.
Well, I mean, getting back to this idea of bringing the unconscious to the conscious, I mean, do you think that helps one's ability to achieve these objectives? You know, in business schools, we have these communications classes, right? And, you know, we teach people how to communicate and how to convey information and so forth. If we were to tell people, hey, listen, the whole point of this conversation is to get people to, you know, like you, respect you, and trust you, and it has very little to do with, or at least to the extent that you're communicating
right.
information, it's meant to achieve this larger goal. Would people get better at it, or would they get worse at it? I mean, the idea
right.
that these motives are subconscious for a reason suggests that you get worse at it.
And I think that's on average right. That is, on average, evolution judged that it was better off not telling you your real motives and letting you think you had these other motives, at least in a wide range of situations. Like, there might be a situation where all of a sudden it's like, so maybe you're a bravado guy about war, right? And we need to go fight those guys, and we got to be tough, and we can't let them get away with stuff, and you're just bravado, tough guy about war. And then you might get close to an actual battlefield, and then parts of your brain might go, this has been working well for us okay so far, but we're at risk of not working so well here. Let's back off on this. And you might suddenly find you were less eager than you had been, because your subconscious is going, this is not working so well. This is dangerous. But when you're far from the battlefield, it might say, go for it, and basically let you blather on about how tough you want to be about war. So in general, your mind has made these choices about what you should know about and what you shouldn't know about. And if it's roughly right about your costs and benefits, then it's true. You shouldn't know. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem from our book's point of view. That is, we're telling you stuff that your mind was designed not to tell you. Now, at this point, you have an option to just walk away, forget whatever we've said, and let it fade in your mind. And you know what? That's a completely feasible strategy. People do that all the time. They read a book or listen to something, and they realize they don't want to hear about this, and they just walk away and forget it. So I will encourage you right now, if this looks dangerous or problematic, just walk away. Forget it. Find something fun. Listen to some music, pet your cat, do something else. It'll work. It'll work just fine.
Well, I mean,
so then the question is,
one part of the book that's easily recognizable is the part about consumption, right? I mean, anybody who teaches marketing is going to recognize a lot of what you talk about there, right? Where, if you're buying a Patek Philippe watch, I think if you ask somebody why they're buying it, they'll talk about the fine craftsmanship and the history and,
Right.
all of that. But, very few people are going to buy it and lock it up. They're going to put it on and go out and wear it, and maybe wear it in a way that makes sure that everybody sees it, but do it in a way that's not obvious that they're trying to get everybody to see it, right?
Or not crazy obvious. I mean, it is kind of obvious to us as we're analyzing it here, but
yeah. But it helped me to understand one thing that has puzzled me. I teach a course on data science, and I always hold up a New Yorker and I say, look at this, BMW ad on the back of the New Yorker. It's insane that you would put this up on print media where maybe 1 in 100,000 of the people who buy the magazine are actually going to buy it, right? Far better to do a targeted ad online, right? Where you send the ad just to the people who are likely to convert. And of course, I think you explained why, no, that's not actually what you want to do. There's a reason why you want the people who aren't going to buy it to see the ads as well as the people who are going to buy it, right? That is what enhances its value as a signal, right?
Right. So a lot of the things we buy, we do to sort of support a story of who we are. That is one of the things that we really want to tell the world is who we are and what we're like. And we want them to come across in all the things we do and buy and consume and experience, etc. Now, usually that's a little hard. If I've got a beer in my hand, it'll be hard to use that to convey very many things about me other than maybe I like it salty or I like it sweet or something like that, right? Because it's just a beer, right? But through the magic of advertising, we can associate products with lots of other things. And so, thankfully, if other people have seen the ad of this beer, say it might be associated with a beach, then I know they've seen beer beach. If I hold up beer, they'll think beach. And now I want people to think beach. I hold up beer. It expands the language of things I can say about myself in a pretty general way. So in that sense, advertising has greatly expanded the products available to us. Mm-hmm. Literally, not just because we can hear about something, but because often the product we exactly want is to say more things about ourselves. We want to project more aspects of ourselves to the world around us because honestly, ourselves are the main thing we care about. We don't care so much about the beer or the watch, really. We care about what people think about us. So then it's important that other people see these associations. So if I'm going to wear a watch and I want to communicate with that I'm rich, I care about technical details, I care about precision, I care about refinement. Merely waving the watch isn't going to do that if you don't really notice it's an expensive watch or very refined or very technically precise. It'll be hard to convey that just by waving my wrist in front of your face. But if you've seen this ad, it can do a much better job of conveying to you these identity features that I would like you to associate with me.
So it's not just that everybody has to see the ad, but you have to know that everybody has seen the ad, right?
Well, I'd like other people to know that other people have seen it. Yeah. That is, I'd like people who see the watch to know that other people will associate me with wealth and precision, or other people who see the beer to know that they will also associate that. And so that they will not just think they have some personal, private information about me, but they will be accessing some information that many other people will also have. And that matters more to me because I want not just private beliefs, I want to create common knowledge. So often, what we care the most about is not private beliefs, but shared beliefs. Shared beliefs are closer to status, say. Your status isn't exactly what privately people think of you and how great they think you are. Your status is closer to what do people think that other people think about how great you are. That's more what status is. So if you want to be high status, you need to get people not only to think highly of you, but to think that other people think highly of you. And that's what these shared markers can do.
Yeah, and you talk also about charity, and I think a lot of people are puzzled by the indifference that a lot of donors have to the impact that their charitable contributions make. And you mentioned that when you look at lists of people who have donated to cultural causes and so forth, very very few of them are anonymous. Right? I mean, most of them are named in the booklet, and when there are those brackets, and I have to confess that I have done this myself. Right, if the bracket goes from 1,500 to 2,500, you contribute
Right.
1,501.
The low
so
end
you
of the
can be
bracket.
exactly, you can get
Right.
into the higher bracket. So charity seems to be one of these things which is all about sending messages to one's audience.
Right now, you might think that people would want to send the effectiveness message. You might want them to think, not only do I care about helping Group X, but I would care about helping them the most, and that if you saw me helping them effectively, that might make you think I was effective about other things and just competent in general. So you might think people would just want to seem to be competent and effective at everything they do, including charity. Apparently not. So we need a better theory. Why do people seem to want to give money in ineffective ways, not paying very much attention to the effectiveness? Why do they often respond to emotional appeals, to very personal appeals? Why do they respond more when other observers are watching them? Why do they tend to favor local people over people far away to help? A number of puzzles regarding charity. And what we suggest in the book is that the people around you will like you better if they think that if they were in trouble and they directly showed you they were in trouble in their face and in their trembling voice and whatever else, the scuff marks on their shirt, and they were just in trouble, you seeing them in trouble couldn't help but to help. That's just the sort of person you are. They could be reassured then that if they were ever in trouble, you might help because you were the sort of person who would respond directly to seeing their trouble by helping. Now, if you're the sort of person who looks in the entire world for the person most needing help, and you focus on helping them, this isn't very assuring to the people around you, because however much trouble they're going to be in, it's just not going to compete with the person in the world who most needs help. They would really rather that you were the sort of person who would help them when they need it, not help somebody far away when they need it. So, under this story, what they need to do is to show you that they have this inclination to help people who are immediately in their face, who are connected to them somehow, who then need help in a vivid, emotionally wrenching way. Because this is what they plan to do to you if they ever need help. They're going to come to you not to show you they need help. They're going to give you the whole emotional pitch. They're going to tears in their eyes and the whole works, right? That's their plan. And
Yes.
so they need to see that you respond to that. You are the sort of person who would respond to that. And so people want to show that they are that person by not helping the person who most needs help far away in the world, helping people nearby who show up vividly needing help, and they have this emotional response. They don't think it through very carefully. They're going to analyze it. They're just going to help someone who asks them who's in need.
So the standard story is that you help the people right in front of you because you have more empathy for them, and the people who are distant, you have less empathy. But that doesn't really address the causation. It just sort of redescribes it.
Right.
And so you're saying the parochialism is really all about signaling to one's neighbors and those close to
Right.
you, right?
Showing them that you would be likely to help them if they were in need. That's much more of interest to them than whether you're doing the most for the world somehow.
Now, you do have a chapter on politics. You didn't mention protesting. I mean, it's kind of hard to understand what's going on right now on American campuses. We have people who are, they're protesting on behalf of people who are very distant, who are in remote parts of the world. And I think if you ask people, why are you protesting, or what do you expect to accomplish from the protests, it doesn't seem like the means match the ends, right? So, I mean, if the best you can expect to get from, say, a protest against the Gaza war is that the university divests from, I'm not even sure what it would mean to divest from, I guess, Israeli companies or companies that do business with Israel or whatever, like how that would impact the suffering of the people of Gaza. What would your take on the motives be for people who are engaging in this type of protesting? What exactly are you signaling?
So, like with charity and with politics, in both cases, we say the straightforward, real motive is to try to show the people around you that you are someone they want to be associated with. So in the case of charity, you're showing people that you would help them if they were in need. In the case of politics, you're showing people that you're on their side. If there's factions that you share with them, you are loyal to those factions, you're helping those factions out, and you can be relied on to support your shared factions. It's less about the effectiveness of your actions and more about convincing your associates that you are loyal and reliable. So now, if you had just weak associates, it might be appropriate to signal weak devotion and mild attachment and mild costs. But sometimes you might be trying to signal very high levels of devotion, high levels of attachment to a coalition, and then you'll need to pay much higher costs. Mm-hmm. And when you're young, it's often worth more to create associations, to collect associates that you'll use over your lifetime. Near the end of your lifetime, you'll more want to draw on the associations you've invested in beforehand, but at the beginning of your life, it makes more sense to invest in these associations. And so it makes sense toward the beginning of your life to be paying higher costs to show your devotion to your associates and to your political causes. I guess a related thing would be...
Does that mean it has to be a costly signal, right? So if there were no consequences for protesting, if everyone was protesting and there were no consequences, I mean, would you have to ratchet it up so that there would be some consequences? So, I mean, if it was...
Right.
You know, if you're just peacefully protesting and everyone's like, great, you know, awesome, then it doesn't really do the job, right? You have to kind of start breaking into buildings and doing stuff like that.
They need to be costs that can be seen as well. So for any given protest, for example, some people might come from a very long distance to get to the protest, and other people might live nearby. But unfortunately, that difference isn't very visible. Maybe, but how long you protest, how harsh the weather is, for example, how uncomfortable it is, how loud you're yelling, those can be signals of the costs you're imposing there. And then if you're taking on illegal, risks, you're breaking laws, then that will be more visibly a cost you're impairing. You might be risking imprisonment or losing your job. Then those are ways to show higher costs.
Right. So in other words, if you there are these employers who are saying, we're not going to hire these people, or universities saying, hey, we're going to, that might actually strengthen some people's motivations to engage in protesting, right?
So I think a lot of, say, protest has to be thought of in the context of the 60s, 70s protests, which were unprecedented and unpredicted. That is, people didn't expect so many, especially college-related protests in those period. And they lasted for a while. They immediately hurt the political groups they were associated with. That is, the Democrats were seen as the people who had more protesters, and then the Democrats, say, lost more elections as a result of these protesters who were disliked by the median voter. But they managed to spin it into a story over the decades of great heroism, and now Democrats look back on the protesters of the 60s as their greatest heroes, who are the most devoted to their cause and most proved to the rest of them that they are devoted to their cause. And even though immediately it was costs and even was costly politically at the time, they have turned that around into their great hero story. So, that's an open question about the current protests. It does seem like the current set of protests are again associated with the left, associated with the Democrats. It probably will hurt Biden versus Trump in the next election, but they might be able to again turn it into a long-term hero story of how devoted they are to the cause. Like, for example, the Christians took over the Roman Empire. They started tiny, they doubled every 20 years while the Romans declined, and part of the attraction of the Christians was they suffered so graciously, so dramatically. Like, They suffered for their religion. They did not back down. They did not recant. And other people were impressed by the cost they were willing to pay for their religion. And that is part of how the Christianity was able to grow to dominate the Roman Empire over 3 centuries. So, these can be large gains in the long run when you convince people that some of your group is very devoted to their cause.
Well, speaking of universities, I mean, I think if you ask most people why they want to go to a top university, they might say something about getting a good education. I mean, it seems like people now acknowledge that they're doing it to obtain some kind of signal or credential. But, I mean, it seems like this is a zero-sum game, and we could probably get the same results with maybe less aggregate expenditures. Is there a way that we could cut back on how much of our resources we devote to education and get the same level of credentialing and status sorting?
Well, one obvious option is just to subsidize less.
Yeah.
So then you might want to go beyond that to even tax. So when something is done as a signal, in general, we expect too much of it. Standard models of signaling suggest that there's over-signaling when people are signaling. That is, people are trying to make themselves look better than other people. So on the margin, they spend in ways that the benefit they get matches their cost, but they don't take into account the fact they impose costs on others by making them look worse when they look better. So that's the negative externality that suggests they do too much signaling. And we could plausibly reduce this negative externality first by reducing the subsidies and then by adding taxes. Now, there can be other effects of education that should be taken into account. So this isn't the only effect, but yes, I would guess that we have too much. My colleague Brian Kaplan has a book, The Case Against Education, and I take much of this chapter on education from him. But unfortunately, what we see is ways that regions try to signal to other regions through subsidies. So you could take sports or art as another example. Like plausibly people participate in sports to show off, to look better than other people. They produce art or music to show off, to look better than other people. So we could, in principle, tax these things instead of subsidizing them and get less of them. But then our region might look worse compared to other regions. We might want to be proud to be coming from the region with better athletes, with better artists, with more educated people. So when it's a global contest for all the different regions to signal how impressive they are compared to other regions, we could only solve this through a global reduction of subsidy or tax. It wouldn't be enough to locally cut back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so tax education, tax medicine, right? We've got some
tax
policy.
Sports, tax art,
tax sports, tax art, tax luxury goods, right? Tax handbags.
Right. But now the problem here is to find anything that isn't signaling. Once you're thinking about it this way,
and then we're back to square one, right?
Signaling. Well,
yeah.
we may be able to find some things, but there will be fewer of them. Like, I think, for example, when people scratch an itch somewhere on their butt, maybe it doesn't look so good, but it's so itchy they still feel they need to scratch it. Like things like that aren't plausibly being done for signaling reasons. So there are some things we can identify.
But it is interesting that we don't subsidize luxury goods and yachts and handbags, right? I mean, why not?
We don't
right?
tax them.
Yeah, well, I mean,
many people have been in favor of taxing luxury goods, certainly. But I think it's less about taxing the luxury and more about the other things. Now, of course, again, if they can just spend the money in other ways, you'll have to wonder whether you approve of the other ways they could spend. But obviously, in some sense, enticing people into signaling in charity is a way that their spending might be beneficial to others. Also, in investing in risky, innovative businesses, I think we actually do a decent job of tempting the rich to invest and give instead of spending on themselves. Our
But I
rich,
mean, if
compared to older worlds, just do less of luxury spending and more of the other things.
But I mean, if somebody proposed that we forgive yacht loans and we forgive luxury car loans and we, have a national debt forgiveness for, handbags and Patek Philippe watches bought on credit cards, I think people would find that outrageous. But when we
I think you
propose
might
to
find a lot of
forgive
support
student
for it,
loans,
really.
seems okay, right?
Right. I mean, I'm sorry, I guess I misunderstood you. You're saying people would not want to subsidize luxury yachts, but they do subsidize education.
Luxury educations, yeah.
Right. So part of the problem is that we often, idealize some things and even make them sacred. And then in their role as something sacred, we are willing to subsidize them and sacrifice for them. And then it's less about maybe their consequences and more about showing our devotion to the sacred. In some sense, sacred things are the things we are most eager to show our devotion to. And that's why people who want to promote things want us to see them as sacred. So schools have succeeded in getting many people to see schools as a sacred venture and therefore worthy of extra subsidy. And they're less interested in maybe the calculation of the job consequences of education because they just see education itself as sacred.
Now, a lot of your recent work has been on this notion of cultural drift. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that. And I think you recognize that there appears to have emerged, at least in the West, kind of a agreed upon consensus around certain values, or at least among the educated elite in the West. And you say this might potentially be a problem. Why is that?
Well, it's less of a problem that we have values, of course, we have to have something, and more of a problem that they keep changing rapidly without much apparent discipline. So human superpower is culture, cultural evolution. This is why we can do things so much better than other animals. And the key mechanism of culture is we copy the behaviors of others. And in order to make that work, we have to differentially copy the behavior that's better, not the behavior that's worse. And to do that, we need a way to judge who is more successful so that we will copy the successful. So our estimate of what counts as success, who are the people around us who we will count as successful and worthy of emulation, is a key element of culture. And that's going to drive a lot of our choices, and including our values and norms. We're going to have compatible and matching with our concept of who around us is the most admirable, the most worthy of celebration and emulation. And if that were just a simple, stable thing over thousands of years, then plausibly it would just have been selected for by past competition and would just be the right thing that we would want to do, and we would just keep doing it. Except maybe because the world changes, we should be adapting our cultural priorities to a changing world. But what's happened is that in the last few centuries, we've vastly reduced the number of cultures in the world, and yet vastly increased the rate at which cultures change internally, not because of selection, not because some win, some lose, and they die out, but just cultures internally just change themselves. So, for example, a whole bunch of trends in my lifetime have been causing fertility to decline, which is, in sort of basic biological terms, a problem. And it's been due to a number of big changes in our cultural norms and values, including what we admire, over my lifetime. And these changes, again, are very large. And there wasn't a panel that reviewed them or studied their effectiveness or did a trial and then decided the rest of us was safe to adopt them. We just wholesale adopted huge changes. So, for example, we have greatly lengthened our career paths. We talked about education, a lot more years of education before people feel ready to have kids. We've changed from a norm of what they called cornerstone marriage to capstone marriage. You married before when you were young and ill-formed and didn't know what career or success you'd have, and you just paired up together and figured out that stuff together, whereas today the norm is that you should wait till you figure out who you are and have settled in your career and figure it out what hobbies and priorities you have, and then go find someone who matches all those things, and then you're matching much later, and then you have much fewer time for kids. We also have changed our norms about how much attention parents should pay to kids. If you looked at, say, movies from the 30s or 40s, you see parents and kids in the same room. Parents are hardly paying any attention to the kids. Today, that's seen as neglect. And we have strong norms about each parent paying a lot of attention to each kid, which makes it harder to have more kids because there's only so much attention to go around. These are large changes in values, and they weren't authorized or predicted or created by some process that figured out that they were going to be effective and good. They are just ways our culture changes internally. So we talked about activists before. Basically, a lot of cultural changes are because different groups are fighting and pulling the culture in different directions, and one side wins, and then we go that way, and then they tell the story about how their win was inevitable and inevitably desirable. But if you look at the net effect, we are just making huge changes in cultures and have for a long time. And plausibly, that's just going to go off the rails. Like a few centuries ago, the world had hundreds of thousands of little cultures. Each little peasant group was a culture, and they were faced frequent, famines and pandemics and invading armies. And so if they went wrong, they would just be replaced by neighbors because there was a strong selection of cultures several centuries ago. And today, there isn't. We formed nation states first, where we merged lots of little peasant cultures into national cultures, and then in the last century we've been creating a world culture, especially among elites. And that has many huge advantages: merging markets, scale economies, more peace, more understanding across the world, but much less cultural variety. And when that's paired with much less selection pressures and much stronger internal drift of cultures, it just predicts that we are going off the rails. And that's a problem because the solutions to potentially fix that are hard, and none of them seems especially attractive or even plausible.
Well, I mean, you analogize this to the evolution of corporate cultures, right? So we have, lots of companies that are competing with each other, and they're trying out different methods, right, of organizing economic activity. And, doesn't that count as sort of within culture competition? Yes. And so why would we think within culture competition couldn't do the same job as between culture competition?
So with respect to any unit, be it a macroculture or a corporate culture or even a species, we can distinguish two levels of innovation, as you're pointing out. There's within and between. So with corporations, within evolution of a corporation is that inside the company, people invent new things, and then those ideas spread within the company to other parts of the company, and then the whole company can be better over time. That kind of innovation is maximized by having big companies, so that for any one innovation, it can spread more distance to all the parts of that company. But then there's some features of companies that are sort of constant across the whole company, and the only way to have innovation in those is just to have whole different companies. And so between company innovation happens because different companies replace each other, and within company innovation happens because each company has parts that can invent things that can spread to the rest of the company. So the fact seems to be that between company innovation matters more than within company innovation. It seems like industries with fewer players are less innovative, and in many industries, basically just growth happens more because bad firms are replaced by good ones, and less because each firm gets better. And corporate cultures, I think, are a good place to get intuitions and lessons and expectations about macro cultures, because the fact is most people who run companies know that most of their value comes from their corporate culture. They're very aware of that, and they're very attentive to try to estimate their corporate culture, figure out what its problems might be, initiate programs to change the culture and reform it to keep the culture healthy and to make it better. There's enormous effort that goes into this, and large programs to change corporate culture typically take 5 years to complete, and 2/3 of the time they are considered failures. They did not fail. This, even though the managers who initiate and manage these corporate culture change programs have enormous incentives and powers. They can fire anybody, they can change budgets, they can, initiate, sessions where everybody has to listen, and they get stock options, or they got enormous incentives to make sure this works. And nevertheless, they still can't keep corporate cultures from drifting into dysfunction. So typical fact is basically companies only stay on, say, the Fortune 500 for 15 years. There's a lot of fluctuation of companies growing and then going away. Most companies die after 5 years of being born. Typically, corporate cultures just drift and then die. And the thing that saves us is selection. That is, we just replace them with better ones. But on macro culture level, this won't work as well. That is, people running our macro cultures have weaker powers and weaker incentives to manage them. And selection is much weaker there. So we should just be expecting our larger macro cultures to be going wrong more consistently, and that we aren't going to be able to manage them.
Okay, so if I understand this right, it's not just that bigger companies fail to adapt because they just slow down their process of evolving, but they actually have a tendency to evolve in directions that are dysfunctional. So within our culture, it's not that our culture is sort of stagnating and grinding to a halt and there's no cultural evolution, but that it might actually be evolving even more quickly, but it would be doing so in a way that isn't subject to any competitive pressure.
Right, so it's a worst case. I mean, you might be worried if our world had stuck cultures that couldn't change and couldn't adapt to circumstances, and we had weak pressures to get them to adapt. You should be worried about that if that were true. But it's even worse if instead of just being stuck, they're just randomly changing. Random change is even worse than no change.
Now, last question I have for you is, in the book Age of M, you recount how, and I think it came out right around the time that deep learning was becoming a thing, and you said that the progress in AI, you talked about the pace of evolution. I mean, you must be surprised at how rapidly we have seen AI evolve, and something like Gen AI, I'm guessing, was not anticipated by you to happen so quickly. To what extent do you think that the emergence of generative AI is accelerating the day when we will have these M's that you talk about in the book?
So my book is about a different kind of AI than we've seen lately. It's about a brain emulation where you take an individual human brain and you try to make a computer model of it. We're still a long way away from that, but I tried to analyze what would happen when we got that. That's the point of the Age of M, and I'm proud of being able to show in that book that it's possible to take a scenario like that and work out many concrete details about it. So that's my accomplishment there, and it still holds because we're still a long way from the scenario happening. There are many other ways to imagine getting human-level artificial intelligence besides the one I outlined in my book. The other scenarios are harder to analyze because we just don't know as many concrete details about them, but they're still worth thinking about. My book came out in 2016, so of course it did not predict all the developments we've seen in the following 8 years. But it wasn't trying to predict those things. That is, I was trying to stick with robust features of what we had seen in the history of AI up to that point, and I think that's roughly right. That is, over 70 years, we have seen progress in AI, mostly relatively steady, but with ups and downs, bursts of accomplishment. And in some of those bursts, they've inspired larger public attention, even investment booms, booms of people turning their attention to train in those areas. And that's been a consistent feature of the last century, really, is to see these booms of attention into different possibilities for automating a wide range of jobs. And at every point, people have wondered, are we finally there? Is this the time when most jobs are going to get automated? Will that happen soon? That's been a big concern people have had. And we're in another one of those booms today. We've had a recent burst of achievement that was very impressive and inspired a lot of attention and imitation and investment and people changing their career training. or even their business school teaching strategies in order to adapt to this new burst. But as in all the previous booms, the key question is this going to be a modest increase in our capacities where we sort of assimilate it and we go on roughly the same trend, or is this going to be a trend deviating boom that will overwhelm large areas of society and radically change them relatively quickly? That hasn't happened in the last few centuries. We've mostly seen relatively steady growth in the economy for the last few centuries, where steady growth means it doubles every 15 years or 20 years. So if you think about it, that's actually enormous change. So we can have enormous change, and that might just be enough to keep us on track for doubling every 15 or 20 years. So then the question here is the kind of change we're about to get about this new burst of innovation, the sort that will keep us on track, or the sort that would radically expand beyond the track. My bet is the first, but of course we should be open to the possibility of the second. This recent innovation is exciting and powerful, but not obviously the sort of thing that would cause more than continuing previous trends.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the spread of tools like Gen AI are going to facilitate the acceleration of this cultural drift, or will it slow it down?
Probably won't have much to do with it.
I mean, when you think about when people are generating these ideas, I mean, a lot of people say that it's sort of like a cliche machine, and that since it's trained on all the data that we currently have, that it just kind of keeps spitting out things that are repeats of what we already know.
The key dynamic is that various groups, usually elites, have conflicts over values and norms and status markers, and they want to push culture to change in their favored direction. This is certainly part of the recent protests, but it's part of many other cultural conflicts. The thing that changed from many centuries ago is that we are okay with this sort of thing. We kind of expect there to be these cultural conflicts, and we kind of like the hero stories that the winners tell about why the changes were good. And so we are pretty tolerant and even expecting and eager to see cultural changes much larger than people in the past would accept or be comfortable with. That's the fundamental underlying cause here of cultural drift. And the fact that you can make more slogans quicker, the speed of making slogans was never a big limitation in this process. I think the more limitation is people sort of being able to make a bid for a cultural change and make an identifiable group wrapped around that and make us see them as devoted to their cause and feeling a moral superiority, and then, having one of them win and one lose. So that's certainly what we're continuing to see. But the powers of large language models just don't seem to be the power. Like, there's nobody who's very convinced the large language model is deeply, sincerely, morally committed to the things it says. That's just not a perception of these things. They look pretty weaselly and willing to say whatever you want them to say. So they don't seem the source of moral campaigns to, affirm some new concept of what we really think is the things we value and what we're unwilling to accept. That doesn't look like it's coming from these sort of things.
Well, Robin, thanks so much for joining me. The book is called The Elephant in the Brain. Definitely check it out. Also, this older book, The Age of M, and of course the blog and the podcast. We will talk again soon. Thanks so much.
All right.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.